sounds somewhat paradoxical. Because if we talk about culture, Sufism is more about inner culture than the outer one. Therefore, as culture and cultivation share the roots, we can safely say that Sufism is more about cultivation through consistent pruning of our inner garden. On the other hand, if we talk about languages, the problem is that Sufism is about journey from words to wordlessness, from mental noise to musical rhythm of our inner spheres. Rather than training one's tongue, it's about educating one's ears to listen to the voice that doesn't use the words. So Sufis have repeatedly stressed upon the point that in words, we can only talk about the things that have similar or opposites. The very quest of Sufis, therefore, is of reality that transcends the opposites. But still, there is a lot to talk about language and culture in Sufi context, because certain groups, and especially the myths devised by invaders, use languages and culture as tool of suppression. And Sufis resist their campaign. We can talk about language and culture for other reasons too. We can talk about this because language, being an integral part of cultural package, is the expression of our inner voice that members of human family have heard in the depths of their very beings. And this language carries the sap of their wisdom. We can talk about language. We can talk about culture because it's method to crystallize our soul, and it attracts us to understand those who are different. So first of all, I should talk about language, and then we will try to understand the depths of our Sufi-related culture, especially in Pakistan. And we can begin by noticing that an ever happening even in the history is that there have been certain groups here who were working to culturally suppress the people of invaded lands. However, Sufis work to show that the languages of the suppressed are equally sacred. For example, Bhagat Kabir composed verses in the language that was considered unfit for sublime message. And it was declared unfit not because gods refused to talk in that language, but because it was language of marginalized and poor people. Kabir turned this language into fittest tool of the sublime. Similarly, Baba Muhyiddin, otherwise Baba Muhyiddin's language, which is otherwise a minor accent of Tamil, is considered sacred by his followers in the West. And if we keep these examples in mind of Kabir and Baba Muhyiddin, we can easily understand the significance and the services of our Sufi poets towards our language. Sufi of our region, for example, Shah Abdul Latif, Khaja Ghulam Farid, Waris Shah, Bulle Shah, and Rahman Baba, and many others, also dignified our languages in the same way. They turned them into sacred languages by making them vehicles of sublime message. They produced uplifting verses in these languages to establish that the God can speak in the language of poor people too. By doing so, they made divine nectar available everywhere for everyone. It's therefore in Pakistan we have a Sufi poet laureate of every language, and this honor of being greatest poet of that language has not been awarded by powerful but people themselves. This is a tremendous service because sacred centers propagate that people, cultures, and languages of, and our languages and the languages of subcultures must be discouraged and convinced that if they want to win the favor of God, they must adopt the ways of powers to win the salvation. In recent years, with the advancement of social sciences, we are discovering hidden dimensions of human society. Theory of basic human needs, for instance, says that every human being, every culture and subculture have need of being associated with the sacred in its own vicinity and the way. This is in line with what Buddha said. Thousands of years ago, that taste it from anywhere in the world and you will taste the salt in the sea water. Buddha, of course, was talking about the decentralized nature of the sacred. Truth or higher reality. It's our common belief that transcendent or higher reality is both timeless and spaceless. In other words, it is untouched by the spatial temporal bounds and boundaries. Therefore, every place is sacred because the reality is scattered everywhere in equal amount. It has couched itself into the rhythm of the universal heartbeat which we can hear everywhere. Another phenomena highlighted by experts in religious experience is called tactile spirituality. With the help of this phenomenon, we can understand the sacred places and the objects were built and crafted to fulfill basic human spiritual need because its people universal desire and need to remain in contact with holy person or a place which reminds them some timeless events in the history. It was to fulfill this basic spiritual need that groundworks were laid for holy places all over the world because every human nafs wants to live in contact with the sacred and feel it. Therefore, devotion to holy places and holy cities is nearly universal phenomenon. Historians of religions believe that it is one of the earliest manifestations of faith and cultures. It was one of the basic ways of experiencing the sacred which has previously been experienced in countless other ways. It's not just experienced as something out there, but sensed in the depths of one's own being too. Therefore, sacred has never been experienced directly, but felt in something other than itself. It was a sign for the people that they do not fully understand or know their own selves. However, one of the earliest global symbols of the divine has been a place, temple, shrine, and people who walk into these places feel that they have entered into different dimension of themselves, of their own being. The places were felt as separate, but at the same time attuned with very physical world we normally inhabit. There is another phenomenon associated with sacred places. Experts call it imitation die, the imitation of God or supreme reality. Seen from this perspective, we can interpret that rituals at the sacred sites are symbolic ways of divine imitation and an act of entering into fuller and more potent modes of existence. Therefore, modern and postmodern disciplines and branches of knowledge are affirming that such sites are sacred to people because they are inextricably bound up with their conception of themselves, their place in the vast universe. It's because these places are associated with profound experience that transformed their lives and kept them connected with the higher forces and sublime possibilities of their own hidden potential. When people visit such places, they can recall the experience of enhanced lives they can possibly have. As Pakistan is facing challenges of religious extremism today, our radicalized youth and people have forgotten that the goal of religious quest has been a quest for an experience, not theology. It was about inner state rather than outer Islamic state. Therefore, Sufis trained our ancestors to walk on the paths because to be fully alive. Therefore, we are in search of ecstasy, rapture, bliss, and our sacred places within or without, like shrines, connect us with the deeper currents of our own existence. They provide us with a chance of getting beyond the triviality of mundane experience and find a reality that adorns and beautifies our own nature. For Sufis, therefore, in every culture developed aesthetic devices for making these kind of experiences possible. They, for instance, made use of music, dance, and poetry so that listeners and beholders could be lifted beyond them. Therefore, Sufis may not teach you oneness through sermons and books, but help you to experience or find it with the help of song, a dance, or qawwali. These devices were to help seekers to witness and experience the unity rather than listening a sermon on it. Therefore, when seekers enter into the state of hal, they feel that they are transformed into a song themselves. The one who sees this by standing on the shores may also experience that in the higher states, one cannot draw a defining line between song, singer, and the listener. It was as if song was singing both the singer and the listener too. Now coming to the importance of culture in countering violent extremism, I want to present a theory by Olivier Roy, with whom I have been working for a very small time. Extremist forces in Pakistan or elsewhere may also face a difficulty in noting that religious practices are closely akin to those of art, and religious experience heavily depend on them. These forces are more concerned with theological explanation, and by doing so, they ignore the very ABC of religion, that in religion, experience always comes before the teachings and explanations. People first experience the sacred in some grove, in some cave, and at the peak of mountain before explaining it. And the same function these Sufi shrines and these Sufi practitioners are playing for us. In the end, I would present Oliver's theory as I was talking about. In the end, coming to the importance of culture in the countering violent extremism, I would bring forth the finding of political scientist Olivier Roy, who is one of the authorities on fundamentalism and political Islam, and known for his in-depth study of radicalization in the Islamic world. Olivier, in one of his interviews, says that fundamentalism is about deculturalization, the rejection of both traditional and modern cultures. And we all, I think, have experienced it. The fundamentalist forces are against, and they are trying to destroy our culture. They openly say that the names, your names, your dresses, and everything which is local, which is of people, is not holy and it's un-Islamic, therefore it should be rejected. So this process we all are witnessing nowadays, is basically a process of deculturalization, and which is at the root of widespread de-radicalization in Pakistan. Olivier is very clear on the point that fundamentalism and radicalization starts from being ashamed of, looking down upon, and then rejection of one's own culture and local identities. And this is what we are experiencing nowadays. So, if deculturalization is the mother of fundamentalism, then what we need is reculturalization. We need to be associated to our lands. We need to be proud of our local identity. We should own our shrines, and we should try to learn the importance and their significance and the key role they are playing to make us connected to the sacred, which is one of the basic human needs, as we have talked about. To Olivier, extremism is product of de-linking faith from culture. When this de-link happens, the religion becomes a tool for the fundamentalists and for the radical forces. And so far as it was linked with the culture, there were other ways of religious experience and religious expression. We were expressing the religious sentiments through art, through music, through dance, through everything which Sufis provide us, and they are still Sufi shrines. We can see these practices. But as the other day, one of our friends was saying that there is need for security on shrines. There is no need of security, I think. Security is needed for the time being, but we need to educate our people. The significant role which these our own sacred places are playing in their lives, how important they are. And we have to let our children know that certain forces are trying to centralize the sacred. On the other hand, we need to decentralize it, because Sufis were doing the same thing. They were decentralizing the sacred, and they were making it accessible to all. Okay? To Olivier, as we were talking about, extremism is part of de-linking faith from culture. And here we understand the importance of culture and importance of this meeting which has been arranged by Culture Department. And it's about changing cultural aesthetics with the aesthetics of violence. We have changed we looked on upon the aesthetics, the beautiful side of our own culture, but what we have gained in its place is aesthetics of violence. Violence is being glorified. Bloodshed is being glorified, and people are taking pride in shedding human blood. It's about changing cultural aesthetics with the aesthetics of violence. This has happened in Pakistan too. And saying yes to the call of joining brotherhood of superheroes who, instead of conquering their false egos, believe that they are fighting the final battle for God. So Sufis told us that your biggest enemy is there within you. What you have to conquer is your own false ego. But we are projecting the images created by our false egos on certain other people, certain innocent people, and we are trying to kill them in the name of God, when we have shifted this aesthetic of culture to the aesthetic of violence. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker of the session is Aisha Ashraf, and she will speak on Mystical Journey of Faith and Love, a case study of Paulo Coelho's novels by the river Pedro I Sage and Wept and Desire. Aisha Ashraf.
Respected guests, honorable national and international Robbie. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to pay my very humble thanks to the organizing committee of this third International Sufi Conference for giving me this opportunity all the way from Rajasthan to come here and present my research opinion and ideas with you. Thank you very much. And now back to my presentation. The title of my presentation is Mystical Journey of Faith and Love, a case study of Paulo Coelho's novels. By the river Petra he saved and wept and desired. Actually, two novels. Actually, I am the co-author of this research article. The main author, she is Hajra Masood from Lausanne University of Engineering, Information Technology, Fazar. And she could not come for some reasons, so I am here as co-author of this research article. I am a PhD scholar in English literature from Naval Islamabad, and I am serving in Lahore University, Lahore as lecturer in English department. Yes, first of all, I would like to introduce the research ideas. First of all, I would like to tell that as this is the age, this is the post-modern age, like after modernism. So everything has been affected, whatever is happening in the world. Even literature is no more detached from whatever is happening around it. So literature has become interdisciplinary, like it has amalgamated politics, it has incorporated gender, it has incorporated eco-criticism, it has incorporated everything in it. So this is the very first, this is one of the aspects that I'm exploring in my research article, and it is mysticism, spiritualism, mysticism, faith and love, this self-realization towards the divine love. The novels that I have chosen are two novels by Paulo Coelho. He is a Brazilian writer, and whatever the novels that we read, these are just translated words, translated in English. So this research paper is qualitative and it is descriptive because I am not exploring any facts, any numbers, any statistics. I am just talking about abstract ideas about divine love, about spiritualism, about mysticism that I cannot measure in numbers. So this is going to be qualitative. And then textual analysis has been incorporated as a research methodology. Textual analysis is a method where the researcher reads text in order to find the application of the relevant aspects that he or she is going to trace from the text. Like I have highlighted, I have researched the words, the sentences, the paragraph, the passages where I have found the relevant aspect of mysticism and spiritualism. But due to time constraints, I will not be displaying all of the textual analysis, but yes, just a bit. Then Paulo Coelho was 17 when his parents sent him to an asylum because they thought he was a patient of psychosis. He was a psycho patient. Now he is the world's biggest selling novelist, but he says some people still don't understand him, and it is he revealed in his interview. Then By the River Petra, I Sat Down and Wept is one of the novels written by him, and it was published in 1994. And The Zahar, the other novel, it was published in 2004. The main concern of protagonist of both the novels is the search of self and spiritual journey of self-realization. A kind of realization that if you read both the novels in detail, you will see that the journey of the protagonist towards divine love starts from the love in this world, the love with beloved, the love with a human being. And this love takes the protagonist to the realization or to the quest of divine love. Mysticism is derived from the Greek word means I conceal. Something is concealed within yourself, you have to find it, you have to explore it. And then mysticism is defined as it's a generic term which joins together into one concept separate practices and ideas which develop separately. Mysticism cannot be forced through a unilateral act on either side, faith formed by love. This is the reality of loving orientation of existence toward God. Love and faith takes the path of divine love. Yes, textual analysis. By the river Pedra, I sat down and wept is the story of a pillar. She is a young woman and she is in love with her childhood friend, and she meets him after 11 years. Like they were children when they met last, and after 11 years, when they are grown up, they meet again. And she finds her love a transformed person. Like he was not seen as he used to be in childhood, and now she meets a transformed person, like who is transformed from within, inner self, within his inside. And he is giving lectures. He is giving lectures on mysticism. He is giving lectures on spiritualism in different parts of the world. So she gets fascinated with it, and so this love of her takes her to her own self-realization towards the divine love. The love between Pilar and her view has developed through many levels: the childhood love, they felt love hidden behind the oppressed feeling, and when they reunite, the liberated love they felt for each other, and the faith through which they conquered their dreams. At an age when everything has been discovered to be made, tools of spirit, she goes to find out her own self. This is the text now from the novel. Yes, my mind was wandering. I wished I were there with someone who could bring peace to my heart, someone with whom I could spend a little time without being afraid that I would lose him the next day. With that reassurance, the time would pass more slowly. We could be silent for a while because we would know we have the rest of our lives together for conversation. I wouldn't have to worry about serious matters, about difficult decisions and hard work. So this is somewhat confused in the novel because you will find the traces of worldly love interconnected with the divine love. Then the letters from, this is also the text, then the letters from my childhood friend began to arrive more frequently as she was receiving the letter. They were in contact right in these 11 years, but physically they met after 11 years. The letters from my childhood friend began to arrive more frequently, and I was envious of the stamps from so many different places. He seemed to know everything. He had sprouted wings, and now he roamed the world. Some of his letters, all made from the same place in France, spoke of God. In one, he wrote about wanting to enter a seminary and dedicate his life to prayer. The textual analysis of the second novel, The Zahir. Zahir is a love story. It takes us from Paris to Spain, to Croatia, and eventually to Kazakhstan, to the 50s of Central Asia. Actually, Zahir is whatever we can see, that is Zahir. So this novel is that how from the appearance, how there is a quest to find something that is concealed in yourself. The passion to find the divine love that is concealed, that is hidden in yourself. That you go out, you wander, you roam in the world, and to find out that thing that is actually concealed in your own self. And then in the Zahir, the writer has been exhibited the philosophical and mystical chronicle of a man's quest for self-discovery. Now this is the Zahir is the story of a man whose wife one day whose wife gone missing, disappeared without any clue left behind. So he is very much obsessed with this feeling of loss of his wife. So now he has become restless and he wants to have a love that he can go with without having fear of this losing the beloved of the partner. So he is there to find satisfaction, and that he gets a clue that satisfaction he can get only through finding divine love. He searches for his missing wife, Esther, a journalist. She's a journalist. One day he found her missing. Frustrated, the narrator is unable to figure out the reason of his wife's disappearance. While examining the reason he must find himself. So this is how worldly love takes you into the divine love. And the idea of finding his wife, the love becomes an obsession with the protagonist, and she becomes his Zahir. Like she is the Zahir and she is the real reason on this world, and through this Zahir he finds the love of God. He is there to quench his thirst for this spiritual love towards his creator. And then one day he is introduced to a tribe of mystical seekers. In the novel, if you read that he goes here and there to find his wife, and in his search, he one day meets a group of mystical leaders who guide him on the way to find the real love. And in their company, he gets a realization that maybe this is the love where I will be most satisfied. There will be no fear of losing my love. Then the novel has remained a mystical journey from a stagnant marriage and love to the realization of unseen, like from Zahir to unseen, even increasing communion with the divine soul. So conclusion is that this study has come up with the fact that the discussed novels move around the spiritual or the search of the main characters. Like if you read other novels of Paulo Coelho also, you will see that he's talking about spiritualism. He's talking about the larger than life concepts of this love, the divine love actually. And then the research study, I'm still working on this article, and I have found that this research study is very significant for the students of mysticism or spiritualism, and how these concepts are related and incorporated in literature. And literature is no more just a story, just imagination. It is actually it is about the real experiences of human beings. And then the experience of divine love is not limited to any religion. This we have discussed, we have listened also in yesterday's speeches that Sufism or mysticism, spiritualism can be anywhere within. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwa. Now our next speaker is Dr. Humaira Naz. She is assistant professor in the Department of History at University of Karachi, and she will present on Persian influence on Sufi thought and tradition in South Asia, mapping the phenomenon of transcultural flow. Dr. Humaira Naz from University of Karachi.
First of all, a very good morning and Assalamu alaikum. And I would like to thank our Department of Culture and Government of Sindh to provide us with this opportunity to exchange the ideas and to discuss different researches with each other. As Rafiq told us, the title of my paper is Persian Influence on Sufi Thought and Tradition in South Asia, mapping the phenomenon of transcultural flow. As it is very clear fact that the relations between Persia and South Asia are centuries old, and there are so many important aspects of life on which the Persians had left impacts, such as political, literary, cultural and religious. So the spirit of Persian Renaissance turned Iranian tradition into a vibrant force and shaped the socio-political ideals of the sultans of the Sultanate in South Asia, the literary and artistic paradigms of scholars, the moral code and the spiritual goals of the Sufis, the melodies of the musicians and the parameters of the medical sciences, the artists, the partisans, the architects, the calligraphists of Iran all came to be admired and imitated in South Asia. The aesthetic and artistic genius of Iran inspired for centuries, the literary and spiritual activities of the people in South Asia, and its intellectual and emotional life revolved around the patterns set by the Iranian traditions. Hardly any other cultural traditions has had such far-reaching and abiding impact on the lives of the people. Naturally, when one links of Iranian impact on South Asia, a world of historic visions and memories glows into consciousness. Many of the important scholars of Islamic sciences who influenced Muslim mind in South Asia belong to Iranian lands, though they wrote in Arabic. When their works came to be translated into Persian, the area of their influence widened. In fact, Persian became, in South Asia, the transmission house for Islamic sciences including tafsir, kalam, fiqh and tasawwuf. If the course of different streams of thought in Iran is closely followed, it would, of course, appear that there has been considerable cycling and recycling of ideas between Iran and India. India is the cradle of pantheistic philosophy, and the Upanishad contain the earliest exposition of these ideas. When Islam reached Khorasan and Transyoxiana, the region's atmosphere has saturated with Buddhist and Hindu ideas. The temples of Bamiyan, Balkh and Merv were centers of Buddhist traditions. It was but inevitable that some of their concepts influenced the Iranian mind. The Karami Masjid was a halfway house between Islam and Buddhism. Sheikh Ali Hajweri has given an account of 12 schools of mystic thought which flourished during the 11th century. An analysis of these thought, contents of these gurus, as he calls them, reveals the impact of Indian ideas. Concepts like Fana, Baka, Halul are inexplicable except in the context of Hindu and Buddhist religious traditions. The some of the Iranian mystical ideas that reached India during the medieval period had in fact originated in India and were cycled back to India under Islamic rubrics. Indian fables like Panchatantra, lexical and phonological traditions, mathematical theories, and astronomical concepts reached Iran and influenced Iranian thoughts. If one surveys the historical landscape of India during the medieval period, a number of Iranian cultural streams in the realm of polity, social traditions, literature, historiography, and mystics ideas seem flowing in every direction, enriching the soil and contributing to the variegated culture pattern of India. Sufism, remarks Sheikh Ali Hujweri, I quote, is too exalted to have any genus from which it might be derived, unquote. Notwithstanding the fact that mysticism has no genealogy and that the mystical attitude was developed in all regions, languages and religions of the world, the Sufi ideology and institutions in Islam were nurtured in Iran. South Asia imbibed these metaphysical and ontological concepts from Iran, and its mystical thought rotated within the parameters laid down by the Iranian thinkers. Ideology apart, even the organization of Khanqa life was largely determined by the Sufis of Iran. Sheikh Abu Sa'id Abul Khair, Sheikh Saifuddin Bakharzai, and Sheikh Shihabuddin Suhrawardi had taken a momentous decision to transform the mystic discipline, which had hitherto remained confined to individual spiritual salvation, into a movement for mass spiritual culture. Iran provided drift and direction, animation and great passion to this effort. Organization to Khanqa life, principles of spiritual training, and demarcation of areas of spiritual jurisdiction, which is known as wilaya, were the crucial matters, and once their details were worked out, the mystic movements entered a new phase and vast areas became available for the proliferation of Sufi ideology and institutions. Sheikh Abdul Qahir Abu Najab Suhrawardi laid down rules regarding Pir-Murid relationship in his Adabul Murideen. His nephew Sheikh Shihabuddin Suhrawardi gave in Awariful Ma'arif a complete code for the organization of Khanqa. Sheikh Fariduddin Ganj-e-Shakr, who was anxious to transform mystic disciplines into a mass movement, taught Awarif to his senior disciples, and prepared its something. The Awarid became widely popular when its Persian translation were made, and mystic of all Salasil turned to it as manual of guidance. At a time when the concept of wilayat was being worked out as silsilas were taking shape, it served a great need of the time. The earliest Persian translation, as could be expected, was made at Multan by Qasim Daud Khatib during the time of Sheikh Shahabuddin Zikriya Multani, a distinguished Khalifa of Sheikh Shahabuddin. A number of mystic silsilas or orders flourished in South Asia during the medieval period. Abul Fazl, the court historian of Akbar, gave a list of 14 orders which have worked in India. Some of the important saints of these silsilas either belonged to Iran or had spent some time in the Sufi centers of Iran. Before he entered India, Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti, the renowned founder of the Chishti order in India, had spent considerable time in the company of Sufi saints in Iran. The founder of the Sohrawardi order in India, Sheikh Bahauddin Zikaria, was a disciple of Sheikh Shahabuddin Sohrawardi and the spiritual guide of Fakhruddin Ibrahim Iraqi. The founder of the Firdausi order in India, Sheikh Badruddin Samarkandi, was a disciple of Sheikh Saifuddin Bakharzi, who was a friend of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi's father. Makhdoom Muhammad Gilani, who popularized the Qadri order in India, had for years travelled in Iran and Khorasan. Khwaja Baqi-Billah, founder of the Naqshbandi order in India, was born in Kabul and he spent considerable time in Mawra Nahar, Transoxiana and Balkh. The Shattari Silsila, which traced its origin to Sheikh Bayezid Bistami and was known in Iran as Tariqatul Ithaqiya, came direct from Iran. Its pioneer saint in India was Shah Abdullah Shattari, who lies buried in Mandu. Sheikh Muhammad Ghaus, an outstanding sheikh of the Shattari order, translated the Amrit Khud, which was a Sanskrit book of Hatha Yoga, into Persian under the title of Bahrul Hayat. The way Sheikh Muhammad Ghaus has used Muslim mystic terminology to communicate Hindu mystical concepts is most striking. He was in a way a precursor of Dara Shikoh, whose Majmul Bahrain is an expression of the same attitude which inspired Sheikh Muhammad Ghaus. The organization of silsilas in India made the dissemination of Sufi ideology easier. Traveling became a part of the mystic disciplines in those days, and Wandering Sufis from Iran and India carried mystic traditions from one country to another. Delhi, Lahore, Multan and Ajodan were connected with the mystic centers of Iran and Central Asia. Iraqi of Hamadan joined the circle of Sheikh Bahauddin Zikaria, disciples in Multan, brought to India Ibn Arabi's pantheistic philosophy, which he had learned at the feet of Sheikh Sadruddin Onawi. Through Khwaja Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, who hailed from Osh, a great Hallaji center, pantheistic ideas of Ahmad Jam found currency in the mystic circles of Delhi. Both mystic thought and experiences derive their sustenance from cosmic emotion, Ishq, which is embedded in the psyche of Iran. It was cosmic emotion that wove the essential features of Sufi soul movement into the texture of Iranian thought. Since mystic experiences could not be explained in plain language, the Sufi poets adopted the language of symbols for the communication of their ideas. Abu Sayyid Abul Khair, Sanai, Attar and Rumi planted the symbolist traditions in Iran and India. Indian Sufis drew inspiration from them. The Indian Sufis drew inspiration from Rumi's moral and ethical ideals and admired his cult of Ishq, but an integrated approach to his work on which could be based integration of individual personality and regeneration of human society was still far out. It was left to Iqbal to turn to Rumi for inspiration and guidance for this purpose. his vast philosophy, his concept of Khudi, his ideal of human excellence, his spiritual goals were all determined by Rumi. On the other hand, Mansur Hallaj is also a seminal figure in the history of religious thought. His works were mainly in Arabic, but he was born in Iran and had visited many countries, including India. It was through Persian works that his ideas reached Indian mystics. He came to be regarded as an embodiment of the principles underlying the pantheistic work to refer to him is the Kashful Mahjub of Sheikh Ali Hajweri, who firmly held that view that, I quote, it would be an act of dishonesty to omit his biography in any mystical work. He quotes Shibli, who is reported to have observed, I quote, Al-Hallaj and I are one belief, but my madness saved me while his intelligence destroyed him, unquote. Hajweri refers to his 50 works which he found in Baghdad and other places, though he considered him an ecstatic means Maghlub under Khalid Khud. He derived much support from him and even wrote a book in reference to his views. While Hallaj's ideological influence remained confined to higher mystic intellects, the impact of Imam Ghazali was more widespread. His Kimya Sa'adat became a popular study throughout South Asia. Its passages were read out daily in some mystic centers. Though for all practical purposes it is a Persian recension of Ihya ul-Ulum, the religious circles in India undertook to translate Ihya into Persian. During the time of Iltutmish, Mu'ayyid Jajarami translated it into Persian. Unique in the comprehensiveness of its approach and incomparable in its psycho-ethical analysis of the basic religious situations, the Kimya became a manual of guidance for the Indo-Muslim society. At the purely intellectual level, it was Ibn Arabi who dominated the scene. Though his works were in Arabic, it was mainly through Persian channels that his ideas found currency in India. The key and kernel of Ibn Arabi thoughts in pantheism, the earliest exposition of which is found in the Upanishads. It was thus a recycling of ideas that had originally traveled from India under different rubrics. The pantheistic philosophy provided an ideological bridge between Islam and Hinduism. Though commentaries on Ibn Arabi's work were written in India by Sayyid Ali Hamadani of Kashmir, Ali Piru Mahemi of Gujarat and others, the ideas of Ibn Arabi fascinated the Indian Sufis when Iraqi and Rumi prepared the ground for their reception. In the propagation of Ibn Arabi's mystical thought, Mahmud Shabistari's Gulshan-e-Raz also played a very important role. One of the most distinguished Persian Sufis who was a very enthusiastic advocate of Ibn Arabi's ideas was Abdul Rahman Jami. His literary works of his mystical ideas were well known in India during his lifetime. Mahmud Gama corresponded with him and Jami created in him an interest in Ibn Arabi's thought. The last great mystic traveler who visited Iran was Maulana Fazlullah, who is better known as Jamali. This meeting between Jami and Jamali at Herat was in fact a historic meeting between mystic traditions of India and Iran. Jami had written Nafahatul Muns to popularize the great mystics of Islam and their teachings. Jamali wrote Sarul Arifin on his return, perhaps inspired by Jami, and after him, compilation of mystic Tazkiras gathered momentum in India. Thus, the ethical and moral ideas enunciated by Persian masters like Sadi, Attar, Rumi, Sanai, and Iraqi became the inspiring motives of the lives of the Indian saints. Taken as a whole, the Persian Sufi ideas and traditions supplied to Muslim mystical movements in South Asia its motive power, its driving force, its ideals and its goals. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sahiba. And our next speaker of the session is Saint Mughal Manjari Sahib, and he will speak on classical Sufi thought of sin and establishment of a peaceful society. Saint Mughal Manjari Sahib, Assistant Professor, Civil Literature.
सूफी साफ़ कयो धोई वरक वजूद जो सूफी साफ़ कयो धोई वरक वजूद जो तंहिं पोइ थियो जीअरे पसंदि पिरींदो हद चले हर को बेहद चलिया न को बेहद के मैदान में खड़ा कबीरा हो डॉक्टर गजाल रहमान रफीक साहिबा प्रोफेसर मोहम्मद सयाद शेख my dear friend and renowned journalist Naz Sato Saab, Dr. Lal Chiskani Saab, learned scholars, researchers, students, and my fellow speakers, Assalamu alaikum. It's immense pleasure to share humble ideas on this very complex and comprehensive theme of the world, and that is Sufism, or classical Sufi thought and establishment of a peaceful society in the light of classical Sufi thought. It's a very brief point of view about this complex idea, complex theme, Sufism. The topic has been discussed throughout centuries, but it has same complexity and same comprehensiveness. And there have been so many definitions of the Sufism. Some people say that Sufism was emerged as a secular thing. Some attribute it to the religion. Some say that it's a spiritual thing. But what has been left out by all of those scholars and Sufis, we can catch an idea that what is the Sufism. I think Sufism is the man's or human beings that aspiration that liberates him or her from all those shackles of orthodoxy and all those hindrances fixed upon him by the people of power. Sufism liberates human being from various caskets of power, either those made by people of power or people of religion, and then it leads towards nature and evolutionary destination of human being. That is simple and functional definition of Sufism. Every Sufi has observed that thing. Then comes the other one thing. Two things are intermixed. They are Sufism and mysticism. Mysticism is a part of Sufism, but Sufism is much more than the mysticism, because mysticism is name of the secrecy, while Sufism opens everything. Sufism reveals hidden portions of human thought as well as of nature to the humanity. Sufism is the name of openness. Sufi travels from one cascade to the other, from one ladder to the other, and in this way he makes the journey, and that journey never ends. You will find it in Attar's discourses, you can find it in Rumi's Haqaiqs, you can find it in Latif's Sufi. So, in this way, there have been different Sufi orders, Sorwardiya, Chishtiya, Qadiriya, so on and so forth. They all are practicing in one or the other way, and they have been very modified from their beginning to the present times. Then comes Vedanta, and Vedanta has been influenced this subcontinent very strongly, because Veds have been written or jotted down on the banks of river Indus, and all the Veds reflect the nature, and all the Veds take a man, a traveler to the journey of nature, and that in this way human being has been familiar with the nature, and he makes that journey through that doctrine that is called Vedanta. And this mixed influence of Sufism, various Sufi orders, and Vedanta has been remained throughout subcontinent. Now we come on Sufism and sin. If we would trace out the Sufism influence in sin, we can say that there have been very natural society in sin, which were the Vedic society, and then comes Buddhism and Jainism, then comes Brahmanism or Shivism, then comes Islam, and then comes this modern nation state world or democratic world, or you can say this world of capitalism. These all factors have influenced Sufism. But Sufism has taken roots from the nature, so it is surviving one or the other way, though it has changed its shape. Somewhere it is being observed in one way, and at other places it is being observed in the other way. But when we particularly focus on Sufism and sin, we can say that Sufism of sin has been immersed in the culture of sin. We have cultural Sufism. We don't have set type of orthodox religious Sufism or any other marketable Sufism, but we have very cultural Sufi thought, which can be seen, can be observed, can be reviewed in the thoughts of poets, in the thoughts of folk literature and other sayings and such type of other discourses made by Sufi saints. Either they were belonging to one religion, one faith, or the other faith. So in this way, Sufi culture of sin or Sufism of sin is cultural Sufism. Then one thing I would focus on, only one thing, that is shrine. How shrine was made, what was the role when it was conceived, and how it has made journey throughout centuries and throughout various eras, and how has it influenced this subcontinent. This is very interesting topic for every person who is chasing, who is pursuing the Sufism or social mobilization of subcontinent, because wherever throughout the subcontinent you will go, you will see at least one shrine every village. I have visited thousands of villages throughout Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. Everywhere at least there is one shrine. But none shrine was constructed by the person who has been laid there. Who conceived that idea? And then shrine is a concentration place of the masses, not only the elite class of that society, but it is the concentration place of masses. Masses come there, they get solace from there, and even they have developed such traits and habits that they now bring issue sons, daughters there, and they confess everything there. That's the role of shrine. But now in this modern times, shrine is going to be changed into one type of market, one type of work. While the Sufism is a natural code, and Sufi thought discourages market. Sufi thought even discourages selling, buying and such of things, because it loves nature. It thinks that everything has been created if without any money, without any cost, then it should be shared, it should be equitable, it should be equal as made by the nature. So it is very great point to revamp, to revisit the role of shrine. How can shrine play a very important role in the development of this society and our subcontinent and Sindh? How can they evolve and they can develop through this very huge institution of our society? And then, in the light of all of these things, social dynamics of Sindh. When we look on Sindh, it has various topographical strips. There is Indus Plain, there are mountain terrains, there is a desert area, and Sindh has a very diversified culture, and Sindh has a river Indus, though it has remained affected various different times, but Sindh has a very different topography, so it has a different cultural hosting paid also. And Sindh has a tribal culture also. Sindh, which is the name of so many villages, Sindh is not still an urban society. Sindh is a rural society. So there should be considered rural dynamics in the light of Sufi thought, as how can we evolve our society through Sufism. Either it is presenting any solution, or it is presenting any other thing. Then comes the problems of Sindh. If we would look on the society of Sindh, media presents a very detailed picture of Sindh. Sindh has entrapped in many problems nowadays. It has so many social problems, right from honor killing to the social isolation. It has so many economic problems. None is owner of its sources, though she has many sources, many resources, right from the base food grains to the tharkol, to the China clay, and then so many governance problems even. So all of these problems face people of Sindh. How can we evolve people of Sindh through Sufi thoughts from these problems? It is the point. All of we have to ponder on that. How Sufi thought can influence the lives of the people? How can Sufi thought influence the lives of those people who are influencing, who are ruling this very downtrodden people are many people of many poor population of people. Then different Sufi movements on Sindh. If we look on the society of Sindh in this movement perspective, we can see that there have been Miyawardari, there have been Madhuri movement, there have been Bilawali movement, and there have been influence of Jog. Such type of movements have been remained in Sindh, either in an organized form, either on the floor or under carpet. They have been remained one or the other way, and they have been influenced this whole society of Sindh. And in that scenario, there come all those Sufi saints and Sufi poets who have reflected on the Sindhi society and who have presented solutions to the people of Sindh, to those people, to those persons who rule this piece of land. And then again, when we are talking about Sindh, then there was a Sindh of Indus Valley civilization, and that Sindh was very vast. Then comes the cultural Sindh, and those poets have versified their very excellent poetry on it, and that is cultural Sindh. And this one province Sindh, that third Sindh, and these are the various expressions of Sindh. And then come these Sufi poets, I can say them thinkers. They were not only saintly people, but they were thinkers and good authors. Shah Latif, Shah Karim, Rohul Fakir, Sami, Khaliful Nabi Baksh Lagari, Khwaja Muhammad Zama, and all the other poets. They have presented these thoughts. And when I'm saying that Sufi thought goes much more beyond to the orthodoxy of religion and orthodoxy of those power circles, because they have reflected in that way. When Sufi Sadiq Fakir says, Allah Oram Chalyam Pant Parahe Pya Bina Nale Supri Anya Ke Pya Waki Da Pya Sadiq Badyo Sandra. Sufi Sadiq Fakir says that they passed over the Allah and they are going far, and they are going in search of that who has no name. Allah Oram Charyam Band Paraye Pya Bina Nale Supri Anya Ke Pya Waki Da Pya Sadiq Badyo Sandra. And that journey is still on and on. They are going after them. As I have cited one couplet of Bhagat Kabir in the start of my talk. Hadar chale har koi, behad chala har koi, behad ke maidan mein khada Kabir aao. Everyone goes to the limits. None goes beyond to the limits. And the Kabir is the only one who is weeping alone in the field of limitlessness. That is the Sufi thought, that is the classical thought, and I think that classical thought presents that natural perspective of unity in diversity. Because Sufi thought presents natural reflections of human mind, and we are living in the age of market economy and capitalism, which focuses only on profit, only everything for profit. They are selling everything for profit, and Sufi thought contradicts that. Sufis think for the welfare of people, they are not thinking for only profit. When Latif thinks that thing, he declares that Tukaya Deyama Muzi Shal Marad. That's anti-capitalist thought. Sufism is a doctrine which gives solutions, anti-capital solutions. Though capitalism seems very pompous doctrine in the world, but it is going to be in that. And it is again going to take a very new form. What form that will be, even the custodians of capitalism don't know it. So this is the very pertinent idea and pertinent point that we have to explore all of those things from these Sufi thinkers, Sufi poets, and to present non-capitalist solutions to the people as the humanity can survive. Because these all of poets have presented love in their poetry. When Shah Latif says, Alam aam asan bhayo to bear kare, pan aaye jaan mandi vand pakhedyo. Vardatam kasrat vardat kul, hakka hakiki hekdo, boli biyamabul, hi ula johul, bilas do sajane. This all hue and cry is from him. Everything is he. As the Sufi thought presents Hamaus, we can say Wahdatul Wujud, and then comes Wahdatul Shuhud. Both of these doctrines, people say that they contradict between them, but I think that Wahdatul Shuhud is even modification of that thought. Hamaus has created Hamazuz. So these are Sufi thoughts and Sufi poets present a society of tolerance that is honor to the humanity, and they present a society which is very harmonious, which is full of peace. And when Latif says, Saim Sadai, Karimate Sindh Sukar, Dost Mitha Dildar, Alam Sababat Kareem, he prays, he begs for the peace of not only Sindh, for the peace of universe. That's the Sufi thought. When Meera says, साजन हम तुम एक हैं देखन में दो, मन को मन से तोलिए, कभी न दो मन हो. So we are only one. If you will weigh two mounts, it is one mount. It will be one mount. None can say that they are two mounts. So we are not two, we are one. In this way, that the whole Sufi thought presents unity in diversity, and Sindh is very rich in that thought. We can take this whole message to those areas, to the masses, to the marginalized people, and we can share these things. And we can share these ideas of Sufi poets with youngsters, with our young generation in a very innovative form. Not only in the language of 400 years ago. We should offer them all those solutions in the form of discourse, in the form of opera, in the form of stage dramas, in the form of simple, small messages, so that they can be attached, they can be associated with their past, and they can strive for their future. And in the end, I will conclude my talk on this couplet of Sheikh Ayaz that Gada Gabru Sindhja, Tui Mundo Khwab, Tuma Jawab, Sadan Swalo. So the only youth is answer to all these questions. He or she has to strive for the developed future of sin, and that is the question of our, that is the need of our, and we have to strive for a very prosperous sin through this Sufi thought, because we have the only product we can offer for the peace, not only peace of our land, but peace of this universe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sai Lisa. Now in first session, now we have our last presenter, and our last speaker is Ms. Sawadia Gasnufar, and she will speak on shrine as a spiritual nexus between believers and Allah in both of our communities. And Ms. Sawadia Gasnufar is a MPhil student in Arid Agriculture University, Rawalpindi. And after this session, we will have a brief slot for question and answer sessions, and then we will have a deep break, and then we will proceed on our next session on Sufi mystical practices and thought. So, Ms. Sawadia Gasnufar.
First of all, I would like to thank cultural department for inviting me to present my ideas to different fields of thoughts. The topic of my research is shrine as a spiritual nexus between believers and Allah in Potawari communities. I would like to thank my research supervisor, Dr. Atul Chaudhary, who always support me and supervise me throughout my research work. Before going into the details of my topic, I think that one should know the meaning of spirituality. Though the meaning of spirituality is not static and it varies from individual to individual, but I conclude in some words the meaning of spirituality. It is an inner feeling of consciousness to know one's reality and divine reality, and individual phenomena. Individual phenomena means the meaning of spirituality varies every individual, and spirituality is a complete way of life. The way leads to kingdom of God. The way leads to kingdom of God, that spirituality is a means to communicate with Allah. And spirituality is associated with every religious tradition. For example, Christianity. In Christianity, spirituality refers as the way to reach fundamental values, living standards, and monasticism is the spiritual tradition in Christianity. Secondly, what is Sufism? Philosophy and practices which embraces Sufism to direct communication between God and man. Sufism contains its end and aims within itself in the sense that it can give access to the direct knowledge of eternals. And the last one is the Sufi experience of unprisonable spirit. The Sufis experiences unprisonable spirit, which itself opens out on the divinity. The next slide consisted on the importance of Sufis and shrines in South Asian society.